Hello and welcome to the Armourer with me, Blue. Today I want to show you the tools each hero has against fatigue, but first to define a couple of terms. Term 1. Pitch stacking is the act of pitching and ordering cards to the bottom of your deck with the purpose of seeing them in the order you pitch them in later in the game. In order to achieve that, you would have to think about how the game is going to play out in the future and sacrifice the efficiency of your current turn in order to securely achieve better turns later down the line. And term 2 is going to be card economy, which is expressed by the amount of cards that go to the graveyard in a turn. For example, playing CNC costs you 1 card, but it will cost your opponent 2 cards to block. If they have Arsenal, it's going to cost them 2 cards even if they block with 1 card. And if they don't block, it's still going to take 1 card away from them. So CNC is a very good card economy card in almost every situation. The idea of this term is that when we play a lower damage ceiling hero, our damage is mostly irrelevant for the majority of the game. And we should be thinking about the card economy aspect of the game more, which is going to allow us to get fatigued slower and potentially fatigue our opponent first. Our first hero is going to be Arachne. They are a slower fatigue style deck themselves, although they fatigue through milling. And since Arachne's damage ceiling is pretty low, we will be talking about card economy. Arachne's daggers are good against fatigue because fatigue doesn't want to spend cards blocking weapons, nor does it want to spend cards blocking 1 damage sources, which the daggers are. Daggers are positive card economy because they cost you 0 cards to play and will demand cards from your opponent in order to block, especially Nerf Scalpel. Nerf Scalpel on hit turns their 4 block defense reactions into normal 3 block cards, which means your opponent no longer has 1 card answers to your 4 damage contracts, which themselves are card economy positive because of their effects. Another good tool Arachne has is Mask of Perdition. It's an equipment that helps you with beating your opponent in card economy every time you manage to use it. Even if your opponent stops its effect with a defense reaction, you're still positive because they spend the card on an equipment. Fatigue decks usually are the hardest to make silver against, so you have to try and use your mask on the contracts with the highest chance of generating silver in order to try and get enough to get your mask back. The more masks you activate, the better. Probably their best tool against fatigue is Eradicate. It's often going to be the deciding factor in your fatigue mirrors, so try to pitch stack it alongside attack reactions. It's going to be your best bet, making sure that it will not only hit your opponent, but hit them for as much damage as possible. Some of these attack reactions are Shred, being your most efficient attack reaction, especially if you're expecting your opponent to keep a defense reaction, or if you have seen them pitch a defense reaction during the time you pitched Eradicate. Cut to the Chase, being an attack reaction that actually gives power and allowing Eradicate to banish more cards, and last, Razor Reflex, a generic attack reaction that some will play anyway. I prefer attack reactions instead of straight buffs like Nimblism and Come to Fight, because they are very upfront and allow your opponent to just block with a lot of cards, which, if they do against an Eradicate with a bunch of attack reactions in hand, we can just say okay and trade 3 to 1 in card economy, if not more, and then just say wait for the next Eradicate. And finally, Plague Hive, which is, in the long game, a card that is going to activate 2 or 3 times, maybe even 4, giving us the chances of rolling Blood Boxes for even more damage, or Inertia, which means even less defense reactions from Arsenal. Next, we have Azalea. Her ability to dominate attacks is an obvious advantage against fatigue because it makes it harder to block her attacks, but not by that much when you consider how many defense reactions your opponents will have. Now, for her anti-fatigue cards. Dreadbore is a ball that baseline gives all your arrows the ability defense reactions can be played from hand, this chain link, which is pretty good because it basically means that if they have a defense reaction in hand, they have 1 less card to block with this turn. Sometimes they will even have 2 defense reactions, which leaves them with no choice but take damage from your arrows. This bow is a way of abusing them for the large amount of defense reactions that they have in their decks. To go alongside the bow, we have pump cards such as Release the Tension, that gives your arrow the text defense reactions cannot be played from Arsenal, so now if you shoot an arrow with Dreadbore and release the tension, your opponent cannot play defense reactions at all. Another such card is Remorseless, that itself has the text that if you put it face up in Arsenal, which your bolt does, your opponent cannot play defense reactions from Arsenal to Remorseless, meaning, again, they won't be able to defend react at all. One of your best arrows to shoot with Dreadbore and release the tension has to be Battering Bolt, because if it hits your opponent while they have defense reactions in hand that they could not play because of Dreadbore, they will have to not only discard them, but also lose life for each. Lace with Inertia and Seek and Destroy are a little less obvious tools, but if they hit your opponent, they won't be able to arsenal defense reaction, making your dominated arrows very hard to block. A situational pump like Fletcher Bootail can potentially be a 1-for-5 if the fatigue deck you're against is something like Bravo, that runs 70% blue cards. And last, the Remembrance for Rangers, Quiver of Abyssal Depths. Rangers are prone to be run out of arrows as their weapon does nothing by itself, and now you have access to a quiver that can help you with that issue. Bolton is next, and despite the Raiden build receiving a lot of support in Dusk Till Dawn, including a card like Beckoning Light that can help you recycle your cards against fatigue, I think your best bet is still probably Saber's Combo, which means abusing fatigue's low pressure to gather some soul and either 3 Lumina Ascensions or Beacon of Victory, allowing you to get to the Lumina, and then using your Courage of Bladehold and Gallantry Gold to attack your opponent for at least 48 damage during this explosive turn. Next in line is Bravo himself, the most prominent fatigue deck at the moment. Bravo, just like Azalea, has the ability to give his attacks Dominate, which should help him beat fatigue, but he has other tools as well. First, I want to start with some of the most obscure techs, like Righteous Cleansing, that can potentially be very good card economy wise if you're trying to fatigue them back, but you probably try to get over the top of the fatigue deck. Although it's not a Bravo specific card, it might as well be. Pummel is a very good attack reaction in Bravo that both does solid damage and is good card economy wise, especially if you couple it with a CNC. Your main strategy against fatigue is going to be pitch stacking your big red attacks like Crippling Crush alongside 3 blue cards on the bottom of your deck, followed by another stack of Crippling Crush and 3 blues, and so on. By stringing your big dominate cards one after the other, you make sure that your opponent will not have space to set his defense reactions in Arsenal in order to answer your offense. Crippling Crush is so good because it's not only very good damage, but it's also very good card economy wise if it hits. Another such card is Pulverize. Pulverize just trades extremely well as a 3 cards for 1, at least, which is great card economy, and if you manage to heave it, you may also be able to dominate it for some insane damage output. Terra Sunder is both dominated card as well as a good card economy card, as it takes at least 2 cards from your opponent when you use it with Anotus, which you don't have to do against fatigue, because you'll be under a lot less pressure, so you can probably use it on bigger attacks. And lastly, Macho Grande, which is a very efficient card with Dominate. Our next hero is Briar. Briar, being a Runeblade, has a bunch of annoying arcane damage that usually is going to be leaking 1 damage here and there against fatigue, especially with Rosetta Thorn doing 2 arcane damage and most fatigue decks bringing 1 arcane barrier. With cards like Channel Mount Heroic and Force of Nature, Briar has access to some of the most damaging turns in the game, so you can try and pitch stack for those, but being an Earth hero, she also has access to a lot of recursion, such as Rites of Replenishment, Pulse of Candlehold, Evergreen, and Soul Tomorrow, all of which allow her to enter attack loop at the end of the game, making it impossible for the fatigue deck to just run you out of threats. Dash is a very interesting case. while her most popular strategy of boosting her deck away is as bad as it gets against fatigue, her pistol strategy is quite the opposite against fatigue. With the pistol strat, you're trying to collect a bunch of induction chambers together with plasma purifiers, allowing you to convert 2 blue cards into very solid amount of pistol damage each turn, that costs you 0 card economy to perform, while your opponent will have to start blocking your pistol damage at some point. So, essentially, with Dash's pistol strategy, you present this inevitability, where you eventually assemble your items, and at that point the fatigue deck just loses, so they have to kill you before that happens, which is going to be difficult for fatigue decks to do, since they have low damage output, especially if you put some defense reactions alongside your pistol items to ensure that you will survive. Next on the list is Dorinthia. With Dorinthia you need to have a lot of patience playing against fatigue decks. The majority of your turns you're going to be attacking with your weapon, which is good card economy. The bad part is that your attack reactions will usually be countered by your opponent's defense reactions, as the defense reactions have better numbers. So once again, it's going to be better if you manage to pitch stack your best cards together, instead of just swinging with them one by one. Stacking a bunch of good reprise cards together is a good idea, since you're most guaranteed that your opponent will block, since that is their game plan. Cards that are going to perform well against fatigue are Iron Song Determination, giving your attacks dominate, Overpower, being just very large buff that you will have the time and resources to play against fatigues, usually, and Rout, being a 2 for 6 at least, and sometimes even more devastating if you catch them on an unmovable that they can no longer pay for. The Queen of Dragons Dromai is next. Usually, decks that can stack permanents on the field are great against fatigue. Dromai's problem is that the majority of fatigue decks in the game so far have also had access to around 40 poppers to block her dragons with. So I'm going to be giving examples with poppers in mind. Burn Them All is probably one of your best cards because it allows your dragons to threaten cheap arcane damage even if popped, and Dromai will usually be able to keep the Burn Them All for a lot of turns. A properly stacked Dracona Optimi can also act as a finisher, as it will deal 6 arcane damage from one source, and your opponents are bringing only 1 arcane barrier. Ghostly Touch is your all-star swing condition against decks that have a lot of poppers and want to block a lot. Late game you have 18 plus counters on Ghostly Touch, and before you attack with Ghostly Touch you want to be able to remove its Phantasm, as well as be in a situation where your opponent has to block with most, if not their whole hand, in order to survive the Ghostly Touch, so that you can freely poke them with the rest of your dragons after. Cards that are going to allow you to achieve that are Semblance, which we can try to bait our opponent with into blocking our 18 damage Ghostly Touch with a single popper, so we can then at instant speed remove its Phantasm and hit them for 15 damage to the face. Using Passing Mirage together with something like Mage Master Bolts in order to be able to right away attack with Ghostly Touch without Phantasm followed by Dragons is another option, but remember that in this situation you have to be able to strip your opponent's whole hand, not allowing them to answer the Passing Mirage next turn, which in turn is going to allow you to continue this loop until they lose. Honorable mentions to Dust from the Red Desert as another tool Dromai uses in order to set up scary non-Phantasm turns. Cards that will help us stack our Ghostly Touch without actually losing all of our dragons are Uvia, that can just produce a lot of Ash Wings if it manages to survive, and Rake the Embers, that baseline gives us 9 Ash Wings, aka 9 free stacks on the Ghostly Touch. After is her little brother Fi. As we said, fatigue decks really do not want to be blocking 1 power attacks, meaning they will let them leak the majority of the time. And Fi is the master of additional 1 power attacks, with his Phoenix Flame coming out of the graveyard for an additional 1 damage almost every turn, alongside the original ninja weapon Harmonized Kodachi coming in for 1 damage twice a turn. He can also use cards such as Double Strike coming in for even more portions of 1 damage attacks. The more scary aspect of Fi for fatigue decks though is his unmatched ability to present chain links of 7 to 10, maybe more attacks, which fatigue decks cannot deal with at all, since they can only block with 5 cards at most. Cards that help you with these turns are Art of War, probably the best card Fi has, making his 3 power attacks into 4 power for the rest of the turn, while also allowing him to draw into even more gas. Spreading Flame, turning into a 1 for 6 or 7 damage in these long attack chains, which is just insane value. Flamecore Awakening being a 1 card for 2 attacks that scales even more in the Spreading Flame / Art of War turns, and finally Mask of the Pouncing Lynx, transforming itself into a 7 power attack during one of these large turns. We move to Icelander, which is yet another deck that can use permanents to deal with fatigue decks. Those permanents being Frost Hex, which is going to turn all of your Frostbites into damage, and Insidious Chill, which is going to strip your opponent's hand out of resources to make sure they won't be able to pay for Arcane Barrier, as well as the Frostbites. There's a bunch of combos utilizing these 2 cards. Some use Ice Eternal, others may use Freezing Point, but the point of these combos are that they will deal a lot of damage to the fatigue deck, without them being able to stop it at all. The next wizard is Kano. His usual combo of Ether Wildfire into arcane damage into Blazing Ether will often not be enough to beat fatigue decks, but thankfully for him, fatigue decks are notorious for their low pressure, allowing him to set up even bigger turns. Using generic permanents such as Energy Potion and Potion of Deja Vu, allowing him to set up double Wildfire turns, and Imperial Edict, ensuring that the opponent won't be able to play Oasis Respite or even Steadfast. Our next contestant is Katsu. He can use Double Strike and Kodachi, same as Fi. The key difference though between the two is that Katsu's turns can be more devastating and harder to block, since he plays attack reactions such as Ancestral Empowerment and Breaking Scales. But these turns are a lot less consistent than Fi's, so you have to rely on pitch stacking for them to work consistently against fatigue, since you cannot expect Katsu's ability to search for your combo pieces. Luckily for you, in Outsiders, Katsu received a card that is going to help you with exactly that. Visit the Floating Dojo allows you to put Surging Strike and a combo card on the bottom of your deck. If you pitch Whelming Gustwave, the turn you play Visit the Floating Dojo and you choose to put Surging Strike and Mugenshi Release on the bottom of your deck. When the deck cycles back, you have a hand with the combo ready. So Floating Dojo not only allows you to stack more easily, but also recycles your pieces. Versus Fatigue, you should focus on the Lord of Wind combo line, as it also allows you to recycle your threats. Levia has 2 ways of dealing with fatigue. One is using Blood Rush Bellow and Art of War alongside her incredibly above rate damage to simply run fatigue over with a couple of 30 damage turns per game, using Blasphemet Levia Consumed to finish the game, or turning into Levia Redeemed if needed, and endlessly cycling cards such as Ghostly Visit, Hell from Beyond, and Deep-Rooted Evil. Lexi is a very interesting case, where she has a deck variant that uses Ice and Pumps together with Shiver or other Dominate enablers, and that version may inherently be better against fatigue, but it's also not the best nor most popular version of the deck, so I'm going to talk about cards that you may want to use in your traditional Lexi decks. In terms of arrows, you already run cards like Drill Shot that are just good against decks with a lot of armor, but you can also consider arrows like Sedate Shot to limit the amount of times your opponent is going to be able to play defense reactions from Arsenal. In a similar vein, you may want to use Codex of Inertia alongside your Codex of Frailty. Another strategy is to make their defense reactions less efficient, with cards like Frostlock and Heart of Ice. And finally, something you probably already play, like Winter's Bite, which basically removes a block from their hand. All of these cards though, by themselves will not win you the matchup. You still want to be able to pitch stack long turns in which you're going to be able to play 4 arrows with a Rain Razors on top, and maybe a 5 arrow turn utilizing Quiver of Rustling Leaves. As the last ranger on the list, Riptide has the least tools to deal with fatigue, as he himself is quite a slow deck, but it's not like he has none. He can use the same things as Elia can with Dreadbore, Release the Tension, Remorseless, Battering Bolt, and Quiver of the Abyssal Depth, but he can also use cards such as Virulent Touch, which are good even when blocked, and Traps, that with his ability can allow him to chip down fatigue decks if he gets them low enough. Time for New Prism. Despite losing her Luminaries and 8 health, she is still a menace to fatigue decks with her spectral auras. All you have to do is continue dropping an aura or 2 a turn, and at some point you're going to overwhelm your opponent with all the value your auras give you each turn, and you finish the game by just converting your blues into 4-tag go-agains with Iris of Reality. Reiner is a natural at beating fatigue. The Intimidate mechanic is very good at removing blocks from your opponent's hand, and Reiner is quite capable of pulling a not small amount of 3-4 Intimidate turns, which should be enough to beat any fatigue deck. Notable cards are Bloodrush Bellow, for obvious reasons, Barraging Beatdown, which is very above rate, and the downside is non-existent if your opponent has 1 or no cards in hand. Alpha Rampage, which by itself attacks for 9 versus only 2 card blocks on your opponent's side, so it's almost always leaking damage. And finally, Massacre, which allows you to remove even more cards from your opponent's hand when you high roll them. Second to last comes the assassin boss Uzuri. She shares all the tools Arachne has against fatigue, but adds even more, such as Isolate and Backstab, both of which are going to make your opponent guess what you're swapping on top of them, and when they guess wrong, you can punish them, and when they overblock, you can just not use your ability, making you win in card economy every time they trade 2 cards for a single stealth. The stealth cards also get put on the bottom of your deck, setting up a late game where all of your attacks are going to be dominated by an Isolate. Her specialization, Shakedown, is also very good card economy wise, almost like a contract, and she can also make a better use of cards like Spreading Plague, because it's much more likely your opponent will commit more cards such as armor pieces to block a dominated attack. And finally, Viserai and Vincent I'm putting in the same spot because they largely have the same tools against fatigue. Both their game plans against fatigue are using cards such as Runeblood Incantation, Read the Runes, and Revel in Runeblood in order to amass a large amount of rune chants, and then attack on both the arcane damage and physical damage axis, making it awkward for the opponent to block both at the same time, forcing leaks every time you set up such a turn, and, as we established earlier, fatigue decks allow us the time to set up big turns. Notable cards for Viserai are Mordred Tide, doubling the amount of rune chance you will make the turn you play it, and for Vincent, her ability, making it so your opponent is forced to take damage every time you use it, giving you an inevitability if the game goes for too long. Oh, and they still have access to Rosette Thorn. Now, for some generic solutions. The very obvious Remembrance is going to help you recycle your strongest and most important pieces, and it's also going to help you with the card economy, but it will reset your pitch stack every time you use it. Some less obvious solutions, like last-ditch effort, are going to allow you to make the final big push at the end of the game, when you really have nothing else remaining. Cadaver's Contraband will force blocks from your opponent, making it always straight 2 for 1 in terms of card economy. Give and Take will do the opposite, where your opponent won't be blocking it at the start of the game, but if you put them in a situation where they have to block it, it will just recycle itself infinitely. And finally, Burdens of the Past. This card can technically allow your big turn to go uninterrupted by defense reactions if it's late enough in the game. And that's it. All the tools we have to deal with fatigue decks. I hope this video helps you better deal with fatigue in the future, no matter which hero you choose to play. And please comment any questions or suggestions you might have. Bye bye.